January 15th, 1965, a Tuesday morning in Detroit. Marvin Gaye sat at his kitchen table, staring at an official letter from the United States Selective Service. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The letter was simple, direct, clinical. Report for induction into the Armed Forces of the United States. Marvin read it 3 times, each word sinking deeper into his consciousness like stones thrown into still water. At 25 years old, he was older than most draftees, but the escalating war in Vietnam meant that exemptions were getting harder to come by. The government needed bodies, young men, soldiers. Marvin set the letter down and walked to the window. Outside, Detroit was waking up. Factory workers heading to the assembly lines. Office workers clutching coffee cups. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that one of soul music's rising stars was about to make a decision that would fracture his sense of self permanently. He thought about his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., the preacher who had beaten pacifism into him with fists and belts, all while quoting scripture about turning the other cheek. The irony wasn't lost on Marvin. His father had taught him that violence was a sin, that real strength came from restraint, that Jesus had commanded his followers to love their enemies. But now the government was asking Marvin to kill strangers in a foreign country, and refusing meant something else entirely: cowardice. The word sat in his mind like a tumor. 3 days later, Marvin appeared at the induction center in downtown Detroit. He had made his decision, but he hadn't told anyone. Not his wife Anna, not his Motown colleagues, not even himself really. He just knew he couldn't do it. The military processing facility was a maze of fluorescent lit rooms filled with young men in various stages of undress and anxiety. Physical exams, mental evaluations, paperwork. Lots of paperwork. Marvin moved through the process like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, answering questions with mechanical precision. When they asked about his occupation, he said, musician. When they asked about his physical condition, he mentioned nothing that would disqualify him. When they asked if he had any religious or moral objections to military service, Marvin hesitated. The question hung in the air between him and the uniformed official processing his paperwork. "Sir?" "No," Marvin said quietly. "No objections." But he was lying, to them and to himself. The physical examination revealed what Marvin had been hiding even from his closest friends. Years of childhood malnutrition, courtesy of his father's financial irresponsibility and emotional neglect, had left Marvin underweight and physically underdeveloped. His blood pressure was erratic. His vision wasn't perfect. There were minor medical issues that, in peacetime, might have been overlooked. But this wasn't peacetime. The army doctor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who had probably seen hundreds of young men that month, looked at Marvin's file and then at Marvin himself. Something in the doctor's expression suggested he understood what he was looking at. A young black man who clearly didn't want to be there, who had obvious medical reasons to be classified as unfit for service, but who hadn't asked to be. "You understand what this means?" the doctor asked quietly. Marvin nodded. He understood. Classification 4F. Unfit for military service. Rejected by the U.S. Army. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt shame. Walking out of the induction center that afternoon, Marvin passed groups of young men who had been accepted, sworn in, assigned to basic training. They looked excited, nervous, proud. Some were probably headed to Vietnam within months. Some would come back, some wouldn't. And Marvin was going home to his comfortable life in the music industry. The shame followed him everywhere after that. It crept into recording sessions at Motown, where other artists talked about friends and brothers serving overseas. It lurked in conversations with Berry Gordy, who had served in the military and spoke about it with the easy confidence of a man who had proven himself. It poisoned his relationship with his father, who never directly addressed Marvin's 4F classification, but whose disappointment was palpable. Marvin told people he had been rejected for medical reasons, which was true, but it felt like a lie because he had wanted to be rejected. He had gone to that induction center hoping for exactly what happened, and that hoping felt like betrayal of his country, of other young men who didn't have the luxury of medical exemptions, of some fundamental idea of manhood that he couldn't articulate but felt in his bones. The worst part was the questions from other people. Friends, journalists, fans. Why wasn't Marvin Gaye in Vietnam? What was he doing while other soul singers like Edwin Starr were making protest music and speaking out about the war? Marvin's answer was always vague. Health issues, family obligations, career demands. But the real answer was more complicated. He was against the war, but he hadn't earned the right to say so publicly. He hadn't risked anything. He hadn't sacrificed anything. He was just a man who had been rejected by the military, making love songs for teenagers while other people's sons died in jungle. The guilt metastasized through every aspect of Marvin's life. It changed how he heard music. It changed how he wrote lyrics. It changed how he saw himself in relation to other men, other artists, other human beings. He started paying closer attention to news reports from Vietnam, not because he supported the war, but because he felt obligated to witness what he had avoided. Late at night, alone in his house while Anna slept, Marvin would imagine alternative versions of his life. What if he had been classified 1A? What if he had gone to basic training, learned to shoot a rifle, been deployed to Southeast Asia? What if he had been wounded or killed? What if he had killed someone else? These weren't fantasies. They were forms of self-torture, ways of punishing himself for choices he had made and hadn't made. By 1967, the war was dominating American consciousness. Body counts on the evening news, protests on college campuses, draft cards burning, and Marvin was still making romantic songs about love and heartbreak, still performing for audiences who had no idea what kind of man was singing to them. The breaking point came in early 1968. Marvin's younger brother Frankie had enlisted in the Army and was deployed to Vietnam. Frankie was everything Marvin wasn't: confident, physically strong, eager to serve his country. When Frankie left for his deployment, he shook Marvin's hand and said he was proud to be fighting for freedom. Marvin wanted to tell his brother that freedom was more complicated than that the war was morally ambiguous, that dying for government policy wasn't the same as dying for principles. But what right did he have to say any of that? He was the brother who had stayed home, the one who had been rejected, the one who had never faced the choice between conscience and duty because he had never been given the chance. 3 months into Frankie's deployment, Marvin received a letter. Not an official notification, just a personal letter from Frankie, describing what he was seeing in Vietnam: the violence, the confusion, the way American soldiers were dying for objectives they didn't understand, in a country most of them couldn't find on a map before they were shipped there. Frankie's letter was angry, not at the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, at the American government that had sent him to kill people who had never threatened Detroit or Michigan or anyone Frankie had ever known. He wrote about how the officers talked about body counts like they were production quotas. He wrote about villages that were destroyed to save them. He wrote about the way war made monsters out of ordinary people. Reading his brother's letter, Marvin felt something shift inside him. The shame he had been carrying since 1965 didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Rage, not at Frankie, not at other soldiers, at the system that had created this situation, at the politicians who sent other people's children to die, at the society that equated manhood with willingness to kill. For the first time since receiving his draft notice, Marvin began to think that maybe his rejection hadn't been cowardice. Maybe it had been insight. But the transformation wasn't immediate or complete. The shame was still there, buried under layers of rationalization and retrospective justification. It would always be there. Marvin would never be able to completely convince himself that he hadn't chosen the easy path, that he hadn't benefited from privilege and circumstance while other men suffered and died. The music started changing around this time. Marvin's performances became more intense, more personal. He began writing songs that had nothing to do with romance or dance floors, songs about social justice and human suffering, songs that asked questions instead of providing comfort. When he pitched the idea for What's Going On to Berry Gordy in 1970, Marvin framed it as a commercial proposition, a concept album that would address contemporary issues and expand Motown's artistic reach. But the real motivation was deeper and more personal. What's Going On was Marvin's attempt to find a voice, a platform, a way of contributing to the conversation about war and peace that didn't require him to apologize for his own experience. The album was Marvin's delayed entry into the anti-war movement, his way of saying what he had been thinking since 1965, but hadn't earned the right to express. It was confession and protest simultaneously, an admission that he had been complicit in his silence, and a declaration that he wouldn't be silent anymore. But even as What's Going On brought Marvin critical acclaim and commercial success, even as it established him as a socially conscious artist with something meaningful to say about American society, the shame remained. In interviews, when journalists asked about his inspiration for the album, Marvin would mention his brother Frankie's experiences in Vietnam. He would talk about the need for artists to address social issues. He would position himself as someone who had always been concerned about peace and justice. He never mentioned the draft notice, never talked about his 4F classification, never admitted that his opposition to the Vietnam War was complicated by his own relationship to military service. The omission became part of the performance, part of the carefully constructed public persona that all successful artists develop to protect their private selves. But omissions have weight. They create internal pressure. They demand energy to maintain. Throughout the 1970s, as Marvin's career reached new heights and his personal life became more chaotic, the unresolved shame about his draft status contributed to a broader sense of fraudulence. He was performing confidence he didn't feel, expressing political convictions that were real but incomplete, speaking from authority he wasn't sure he possessed. The drug use that would eventually consume Marvin's life wasn't solely about escaping the shame of his military rejection, but that shame was part of the cocktail of guilt, inadequacy, and self-doubt that made chemicals seem like a reasonable solution to emotional problems. In 1982, when Marvin recorded Sexual Healing in Belgium, he was living in exile from America, hiding from the IRS and his ex-wives and his own reputation. During those recording sessions, according to people who were there, Marvin talked obsessively about Vietnam veterans who had come home broken and addicted. He expressed guilt about not serving, but also vindication that he had avoided the trauma that destroyed so many men his age. The conversation was circular and obsessive. Marvin would argue with himself, taking both sides of a debate that could never be resolved. Had he been wise to avoid Vietnam, or had he been cowardly? Were the men who served heroes or victims? Was his opposition to the war principled or convenient? There were no clean answers, just the grinding repetition of questions that had been eating at him for 17 years. On the night of April 1st, 1984, when Marvin Gaye Sr. shot and killed his son, the argument they had been having was about money and drugs and control. But underneath those immediate issues was the deeper, older conflict about manhood and courage, and the kind of men they both were. Marvin Sr. had served in World War II, not heroically, not with distinction, but he had served. He had answered when his country called. And his son, the famous one, the successful one, the one whose name was known around the world, had been rejected by the military, had stayed home, had made love songs while other men fought. In the final argument between father and son, this history was present even if it wasn't explicitly discussed. Two men whose relationship to violence and authority in national service had shaped their understanding of themselves and each other. Two men who had never found a way to talk honestly about the shame they both carried. The gunshot that killed Marvin Gaye silenced a voice that had been asking questions about peace and war and the cost of both since 1965. But the questions didn't die with Marvin. They remain embedded in his music, in the songs that tried to make sense of American violence, in the artistic legacy of a man who spent his life trying to reconcile his principles with his circumstances. What's Going On endures not just because it's musically sophisticated or socially relevant, but because it captures something essential about the experience of being a conscious person in a violent world. The album is the work of someone who understands guilt and complicity and the difficulty of maintaining moral clarity when survival is at stake. Marvin never completely resolved his shame about avoiding Vietnam. He carried it to his grave. But in transforming that shame into art, he created something that spoke to millions of people who were carrying their own unresolved guilt about choices they had made or hadn't made, paths they had taken or avoided. The draft notice that arrived in January 1965 was supposed to be the beginning of military service. Instead, it became the beginning of a different kind of service. A lifetime of musical witness to the cost of war and the complexity of peace. A career spent trying to understand what it means to be a man in a world that confuses violence with strength, aggression with courage, silence with complicity. Today, when people listen to What's Going On, they hear a protest album, a statement against the Vietnam War and American foreign policy. But for those who understand Marvin's history, who know about the draft notice and the 4F classification and the decades of shame that followed, the album is something more personal and complicated. It's the sound of a man trying to find a way to be heard without having to apologize for who he is. The sound of someone who discovered that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons, and that sometimes the hardest enemy to face is the voice in your own head telling you that you're not worthy of the platform you've been given. Marvin Gaye never served in the military, but he served something else. Something harder to define but no less important. He served the truth as he understood it, even when that truth was incomplete or contradictory. He served the questions even when he couldn't provide the answers. And in the end, maybe that's the most courage anyone can manage. Not the courage to kill or be killed for abstract principles, but the courage to keep asking what those principles mean and whether the people who invoke them are worthy of the sacrifices they demand from others. The shame never left him, but it also never silenced him. And perhaps that's the real victory, not the absence of guilt, but the refusal to let guilt become an excuse for silence, the willingness to speak even when you're not sure you have the right to be heard. That willingness cost Marvin Gaye everything, his peace of mind, his relationships, eventually his life. But it also gave the world something irreplaceable, a voice that insisted on complexity in a time that demanded simplicity, a perspective that honored both conscience and circumstance, a sound that captured what it feels like to be human in an inhuman world. The draft notice is long gone, lost to time and moves and the general entropy that claims all documents, but its impact ripples through every song Marvin recorded after 1965. Every question he asked, every answer he refused to accept. In the end, that may be the most important thing any artist can do, not to provide comfort or certainty, but to bear witness to the difficulty of being alive, to create space for the questions that don't have easy answers, to remind us that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you don't know what bravery looks like.